November 1966. 3 years before the Apollo astronauts made it to the moon, the Orbiter 2 spacecraft situates itself in lunar orbit. It was designed to capture high-resolution images of the surface to assist with the selection of landing sites for the Apollo missions. One image in particular catches the eye of researchers as it shows what appear to be the shadows of several pointed spires.
On November 20th, 1966, the Lunar Orbiter 2, NASA's probe, photographs this area on the moon that was actually in the Sea of Tranquility only 300 kilometers away from where Apollo 11 ended up landing. And what's so bizarre is that this area has undeniable architecture that looks like what you would see from obelisks. There's 8 different spires, and scientists calculated that the largest of these spires would be an obelisk that is 15 stories tall. These do appear to be just like an Egyptian-style obelisk, but what the heck are they doing on the moon?
Of the multiple anomalies on the moon, I think the spires are some of the most fascinating ones because astronomers have calculated that these spires are very tall for them to be exclusively natural occurrences.
They have to be artificial, simply from the fact that the moon has been bombarded in kind of an incessant meteoric rain for 4.5 billion years. There is no way that anything bigger than a basketball can be standing straight up on the lunar surface.
The inference is that NASA would have known this, and that one of the reasons that they sent their mission there was so that the astronauts of the Apollo mission could gain more information about these artificial structures on the moon.
Telcom, go. Jinsei, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, work, go for undocking. Roger, Eagle, undock.
On Apollo 11, when the astronauts were descending to the lunar surface, they got this very strange computer alarm.
It's 1202 alarm. 1202 alarm.
The famous 1202 computer alarm, and then basically nobody knew what it was. What it came out to was that the computer itself was overwhelmed with information. Because Buzz Aldrin, the lunar module pilot, had turned on the radars on the lunar lander. It had 2 radars. It had a side-looking radar, and it had a docking radar. So in other words, you had one that pointed down and one that pointed to the side. Now, if there's nothing on the surface of the moon, if there are no artificial structures, if there are no spires sticking 10, 20 stories up into the sky, why would you turn on the side radar? There's no reason to, but Aldrin did it, and I think it's because he knew, and NASA knew, that there was some danger of running into these things.
Is it possible that NASA actually has knowledge of structures on the moon? In 1960, NASA officials commissioned a report from the Brookings Institute to weigh the implications of the discovery of evidence of extraterrestrial life. Due to the findings of the report, researchers believe it was determined before the moon missions to keep any extraterrestrial findings hidden from the public for fear of social unrest.
Since the time of the very first Apollo moon missions, researchers have pored over NASA and Russian photos of the moon, looking for structures. And they found some unusual things. You would think, in fact, that if extraterrestrials are on the moon, or were, that they would have built all kinds of structures. And we're able to see some of these, even though NASA scientists don't acknowledge them as genuine.
Huntsville, Alabama, July 24th, 1969. A crowd of thousands gathers in Courthouse Square to cheer on the triumphant return of Dr. Wernher von Braun. just hours after Apollo 11's Columbia Command Module splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The United States had achieved what many believed was impossible, putting a man on the moon. The picture ran in newspapers around America the following day, celebrating the genius rocket engineer who was behind it all.
Von Braun is a titan, you know, he's one of the major figures of the last century, and he was way ahead of his time.
Von Braun adamantly believed that humanity's future was in space. He's the greatest voice we've had in the history of the space program.
Considered by NASA to be the father of rocket science, von Braun is credited with either inventing or helping to develop many of the most sophisticated aerial technologies that exist today, like the supersonic anti-aircraft missile, the ballistic missile, the first American satellite, and the first U.S. space vehicles, including the enormous Saturn V rocket that enabled man to reach the moon.
Without exaggeration, the Apollo program has been called the greatest achievement that mankind has ever accomplished. Without Wernher von Braun, we would not reach the moon. To date, the Saturn V is the most powerful rocket that we've ever built.
Von Braun's incredible engineering feats were matched only by his all-consuming crusade to send man into space. In the 1950s, when space travel seemed a fantasy, Wernher von Braun teamed up with Walt Disney to convince a skeptical public that putting man on the moon was not only possible, but that it would happen in their lifetimes. In these films, watched by an estimated 42 million people, von Braun boldly predicted not only how we would send men into space, but also the use of protective suits, lunar landing vehicles, orbiting space stations, and even manned trips to Mars.
If we were to start today on an organized and well-supported space program, I believe a practical passenger rocket could be built and tested within 10 years.
But who exactly was this engineering genius with such extraordinary visions for the future? Why did he believe so strongly that man could and should travel into space? And what did he expect to find when we got there? Wernher von Braun was born March 23, 1912, in a small town in eastern Prussia. The second of three sons, Wernher grew up a child of wealth and privilege. But while he was born into an accomplished family, Wernher's keen intellect and unusual passions stood out. His father once said, "I don't know where his talent comes from," and stated on more than one occasion that he considered his son a mystery.
Wernher von Braun was multi-talented. Both sides of his brain were working. He could think about technical things and imagine rocketry and space travel, but he was an accomplished musician. And these traits manifested very early. I think his parents knew by the time he was 4 or 5 that he was very special. His mother gave him a telescope when he was young, and he looked at the moon and said, "I want to go there. I want to build the machine that will go to the moon." And of course he did half a century later.
Tranquility Base, Houston. Guidance recommendation is pings, and you're cleared for takeoff.
July 21st, 1969. Approximately 21 and a half hours after landing on the moon, the lunar module Eagle lifts off to rejoin the command module Columbia and begin the return to Earth. The astronauts take with them 47.5 pounds of lunar surface material, and they leave some items behind as well, like scientific instruments, an American flag, and a small plaque commemorating the Apollo 11 mission. But perhaps most curious of the items left on the moon was a small bag containing a gold replica of an olive branch and a silicon disc with recorded messages of peace and goodwill from 73 world leaders. Why were these symbolic messages sent up into space? Some ancient astronaut theorists suggest that the mastermind behind the Apollo program, Wernher von Braun, was expecting to find more on the moon than NASA wanted the public to know.
Wernher von Braun famously said that the next world war will be the war against the ETs. His remarks were hugely controversial. Some people have said that he was simply saying there can't be another world war now that we've got atomic weapons. Other people have speculated that he knew something and he was hinting at some terrible truth.
Another story relates that von Braun claimed that we had help from them to get us into space. If anybody knew about the extraterrestrials, it would have been a guy like Wernher von Braun.
Some ancient astronaut theorists propose that not only did alien beings have a hand in man reaching the moon, but that once there, we discovered further evidence that we are not alone. And they claim the strongest proof can be found by examining our last manned trip to the moon, the Apollo 17 mission in 1972.
We definitely weren't told everything, and there's monkey business played with the moon landings, of course, as far as what we know about them.
Apollo 17 was in fact a technology salvaging mission.
Yeah, it looks like there's been a geologist here before us.
Some of it has to do with the actual landing site itself. There were several mountains in the area that don't really look like mountains. One of them is very hexagonal looking, and they bear a striking resemblance to actual artificial structures. The astronauts went directly for this hexagonal mountain. They parked on the hill above it, and then they got out of the lunar rover. What's interesting is that for the next 20 or 30 minutes, NASA has control of the camera on the rover, and they point it at everything except what the astronauts are doing. They had plenty of time to rappel down inside of this V-shaped depression.
Okay, let's go on back. I am.
It's really interesting that we don't see any of the astronauts at all until they come back to the lunar rover.
Here we go.
There's no question that the mystery would be what they were looking for, what they found. Could it possibly have been ancient alien technology?
Ancient astronaut theorists suggest that even more compelling than the hexagonal formation is what appears at another spot that was filmed. The Shorty Crater.
There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange!
In Shorty Crater, you can see orange soil that was discovered at the landing site, and the reason the soil was orange was because it had a great deal of oxygen in it, which was kind of a surprise. But the biggest surprise is if you actually look in the crater, what you see are objects that at first might to the naked eye appear to be rocks, but in fact, as you study it with an engineer's eye, what you see is mechanisms. And right in the middle of it, there's a very interesting object that as you zoom up on it, it begins to look more and more like a human head.
Mike Barra and fellow researcher Richard Hoagland obtained early generation negatives from Shorty Crater, and upon enhancing the colors present in the film, found that the object appears metallic.
The most intriguing thing is that on the upper part of the mouth, there was a bright, distinct red stripe painted across it, and it glowed and shone as if it were metallic. You then come to the realization that what you're probably looking at is the head of a humanoid-appearing robot, the leftovers of an explosion that damaged and destroyed a bunch of mechanical stuff.
Reaching the moon was such an unbelievable feat that even to this day, many people are convinced the entire event was actually staged in a Hollywood studio. But ancient astronaut theorists suggest not only did we land on the moon, but what we found there was more incredible than we know.
During the 1969 Apollo moon mission, after the landing, there was a very strange 2-minute gap in radio transmissions. And what happened during those 2 minutes has been subject to a lot of controversy.
Neil, this is Houston, radio check, over. Columbia, this is Houston, over. White object.
According to scientist and NASA researcher Otto Bender, various ham radio operators were able to intercept secret communications with mission control that were not made public.
The astronauts apparently talked about seeing extraterrestrial objects on the moon, including flying saucers parked along the edge of a crater within their view.
Now, the truth of it is that each of the astronauts had a separate medical channel. That channel was not public, and it could have been very easily used to communicate information that you didn't want to be heard over the general public transmissions. What's really interesting about that story, though, is the fact that within 30 minutes of the landing on the moon, that story was circulating around NASA that, hey, guess what? They saw something on the rim of a crater, they were all upset, they didn't know what to do, they didn't know if they should go out.
It is interesting when you watch the feed of when they came back from the moon. And they're not sitting there jumping up and down for joy and saying, I had the most incredible experience in my life, I was on the moon. They're not saying that. They look very sullen, very depressed. They're looking down. They almost look like they want to vomit. That's how disturbed they look. Could they have seen something there that they didn't want to tell the public because of the implications?
I believe that what this country set out to do was something that was going to be done sooner or later.
We find for the first time that man has the flexibility or the option of either walking this planet or some other planet. It's a beginning of a new age.
After Apollo 11, NASA would send 6 more manned missions to the moon, culminating with Apollo 17 in 1972.
One of the most interesting questions with regard to our interaction with the moon is why we have never gone back there again since the Apollo missions. And what else is very telling is that although the USSR at the time was getting to be quite able to send its own astronauts to the moon, it never seems to have done so. Could it be that there were agencies associated with the moon, aliens or other beings who had warned humanity to stay away for some reason?